I know you had asked in your artist statement about providing a number to grade each of the individual pieces. That's not something I typically do because I think that whether a piece is working or not is pretty nuanced. And I think that there's something problematic about that because different pieces are trying to achieve different things. But I'm going to do it because you had requested it. But just know that I'm going to evaluate each piece based on whether it seems like you are intending to create a finished work versus a sketch, because I think they have different roles to play. Sketches are very important because they let you practice certain skills. On the other hand, learning how to really create a piece that has a sense of intentional resolution is a whole other skill in itself. So this first piece, I'm going to assume you're trying to do a completed composition. I would say 5. This is one of your weaker pieces. I would say 3 or 2. This piece, I would say 4. This piece 4. I like that you're doing 3D work a lot. I think one thing you need to improve upon is photographing your 3D pieces because the photographs don't have very good lighting. I think the backgrounds are distracting. So I'm going to send you a link to a video where I explain how to photograph 3D work. I would say this one is a 3. This one, 4. 4. This one, I would say probably like a 6. This is one of my favorite pieces in your portfolio. So I think this one is a 7 or 8. This piece, I think, is a 3 or 2. 3D work is really difficult to do, especially if you don't have the tools, if you don't have the expertise of somebody who really understands the construction of 3D work. So I'll give you some video tutorials that maybe will make that a little bit easier because there are some really simple things you can do with materials that can provide better results with less expertise. This I'm going to assume is a master study because it's after the George Bellows painting. So as a master study, I would say 4. This piece 4. This piece 4. I'm going to assume this one is a study. So probably a 3 or 4. I really like this piece a lot. It doesn't seem like it's finished yet, but I would say if you do spend the time to finish it, it's well on its way to being an 8. This piece is 7. I think 6. This one 5. This one 5. But again, it's like there are certain parts of it that I think are really nicely done. There are other parts that I think have been neglected. So that's why it is so tricky to grade individual artworks because there are certain things that work great and other things that don't. I'm going to assume this one's a study. So 4? Yeah. All right. So let me go back and I'll talk about the entire portfolio overall. And so one of the things that I think you're really good at, number one, is just working with a broad range of subjects. You have a lot of multi-figure compositions, and these are really hard to do. I think it's one of the reasons why a lot of people don't do multi-figure compositions. And actually, I really like this one a lot because it has a range of sizes. So like you have this figure on the far left who's tiny, you have the big figure. And so this piece really shows an amount of depth and interaction between the figures that I think is really working well. So I think good for you for tackling so many figures in a single composition. That said, though, it is really tricky. Like I think this one, space-wise, is a little bit scattered. It's hard for me to tell exactly where the figures are located in space, but it's also not exaggerated enough for me to feel like it's supposed to be something more surreal or something in a dream. And I also think it's really good that you're tackling backgrounds. A lot of people are really afraid to do backgrounds, and I think this one has a great sense of atmosphere. There's a certain mood to it. I really like the way you're doing the brush work. So good for you on doing the backgrounds. In terms of sculpture, I think it'd really help for you to look at Barbara Hepworth. I mean, this really reminds me a lot of her pieces, but I think a lot of the things about your 3D work right now is the craftsmanship just isn't there. And 3D artwork, it's so hard to do well. And if your technique is even like a little bit not great, it's like very, very obvious. It's extremely unforgiving in that way. So that's tricky. I would also say in terms of your other 3D piece, I would take a look at Alexander Calder. He's done a great job with his mobiles. And I know that Moreau and Tanguy are not 3D artists, but I think if you look at their shapes, that would be very helpful in terms of what you want to do with your 3D work. And then I would also say that your consistency in your portfolio, it varies a lot. Like, for example, you have pieces like this, which feel like a exercise or a fragment, and that's fine. I mean, I don't know if you have any intent on trying to show the work online or at a gallery or anything like that, but I would say that cohesion, if you do want to show online or have a show or something like that, is pretty important. And right now your portfolio is pretty scattered. Now that can be a really positive attribute though, especially if you're somebody who doesn't have like decades of experience. I actually think that's a great place to start, because I think what I find sometimes is people try to focus in on something way too soon before they're ready for that. So my impression right now is that you're more exploring. You're trying out a bunch of different things, and that's great. And I think you should keep doing that for a little while. My sense right now is that you don't quite have the technical expertise or experience yet to be really creating a cohesive body of work. I mean, if you want to, that's a whole other can of worms. But I think right now, I would work on beefing up your technique, because your technique in a lot of areas is still a little bit shaky. And I think one thing that I'm not really seeing in the portfolio is it doesn't seem like you're very assertive about a lot of your marks. It seems like you're better in painting, because it does seem like your paintings, like especially this still life and also the background, you do tend to be a lot bolder in terms of the brushwork. The color is a lot more vibrant. So I would say between the sculpture, the pastel drawings, and the paintings, right now your strongest area is in painting. I think the drawings, with the exception of this one, I think that they're a little bit fuzzy and not very well defined. Now that said, though, you don't necessarily want everything to be that well defined. Like, this is a really beautiful atmosphere that you're creating in this landscape. And actually, I really like some of these white highlights in here. But I think the issue with this piece is that it's all the same articulation. So like everything is fuzzy. So you have to think about yourself almost like as an editor. So you look at this drawing and you say, okay, is there any part of this drawing that I really want my viewers to be captivated by? And so, for example, one thing you can do is make the stuff in the foreground that's closer to the viewer a lot more detailed, higher in contrast, make the stuff in the background blurrier, lower in contrast. And that's a technique called atmospheric perspective. So being a little bit more intentional about that, and maybe just asking yourself as you look at the paintings, pretend you're almost like a movie director. Like, there are all these different roles. So you have like a main actor, you have supporting actors, you have people that are extras. So you could say to yourself, okay, between these three figures, which is the one that I really want to call attention to, and which is one that could maybe fade a little bit more in the distance? Because it does feel right now in your drawings that everything is drawn to the same level of importance. And I don't think you can do that, because I think it starts to get very monotonous very fast. And as a viewer, we don't really feel like there's a lot of direction in the piece. So you could, for example, say in this still life, hey, I really want that lemon to really pop. And then maybe I want the glass on the left-hand side to recede more into that distance. So I think maybe planning more in advance what your intent is. I don't know if you do thumbnail sketches, but I would recommend doing that, because oftentimes you can work out issues in the background or figure out how you want the figures to balance off of each other. Like in this scene, my assumption would be that the two dancers in the front, they seem more important than the figure on the right-hand side, who's more of a bystander. So you could say, okay, that person on the right, I'm going to make them lighter so they're lower in contrast. And you could even make them smaller so that way they don't call so much attention to themselves. So really thinking about that in advance can make a really big difference. Now, of course, I mean, as you're working on the piece, different things come up and you can certainly react to that. But I do find having a loose plan or certain agenda, because I think what happens is if everything is important, none of it really pops. Like here you have a lot of items on the dresser or the fireplace, the surface that it's sitting on. And yet the only one that starts to have a little bit more priority is this yellow vase. This one does seem more important than the ones on the left-hand side, but I think you could push that more. I think right now it doesn't seem intentional enough. And then I would just say that there's sort of a lack of consistency, because you have some pieces like this one really feels pretty much done, as in you filled in all the figures, there's definitely background. Same thing with this one, same thing with, like, this one to me is your most complete finished piece. I think it's probably the strongest piece in the whole portfolio. But the thing is, you have a lot of pieces that are pretty incomplete or feel almost like fragments. Like this one, you have the objects on the table, you have the painting in the upper right, but the painting in the upper right, it feels like it's not connected to the rest of the piece. I mean, it almost feels like it's collaged onto the surface of the paper. And so I think you need to think about, okay, of all these parts to a certain image, but how do they relate? Like here, the background, it almost feels like it doesn't connect to the figures. Like it almost seems like two paintings that have been stuck together. So you really have to start looking at relationships in your portfolio. Like, how does that blue background of shapes relate to the figures? Because you can have individual components that look great on their own, but maybe are not working so well together. And so you really have to start thinking about those compositions. And I think as far as your pastel technique goes, I think you need to work on having more layers. I think that you need to have a stronger variety of different amounts of physical pressure. So I'll send you a couple videos where I demonstrate different techniques with soft pastels. And I think what you'll notice is that in a lot of these, your soft pastel is pretty thin. And I think what's helpful with pastel is that you have some areas that are thin. Like I would say this background is probably a good candidate for keeping pretty thin, but then maybe on the figures, like really build up and press hard with that soft pastel. Because I think the issue is in a lot of these, we're getting a lot of the white grain of the paper. Now, one thing you can do to combat that is using a toned piece of paper, or even a black sheet of paper is really great. Like they sell a lot of pastel papers that are like toned green or brown. I could really suggest you do that, because when you're doing soft pastel, if you're using white paper, it really has this unfinished look to it that's very hard to get rid of. I mean, you would have to build up a crazy amount of pastel to get rid of that. And so having that toned paper can make a really big difference. And I also think if you're going to be working with anatomy, I mean, you have a lot of figurative pieces, I would definitely take a look at our anatomy series, because understanding the anatomical structure of the figure is really helpful. So you know what to look for, because a lot of your anatomy, I think, is a little bit odd. Like I would say the arch of the back of this figure on the right is a little bit awkward. I would say this figure on the left has a pretty good sense of gesture. The head's a little bit odd in terms of proportions, but I think that'll just be a really nice foundation for you. So let's take a look at the individual pieces. I think this piece composition-wise, it feels a little lopsided because you're like crowding the center area with all of these objects. But the thing is, there's almost this like blank background. And so I might spend a little bit more time arranging things. I don't know if this is from a photo or if it's something that, say, you have access to, but really half of a still life, the success of it, is contingent upon the arrangement of the object. So you can have great drawing technique, but if you have a drawing of a still life that is sort of clumsily put together, it's like there's only so much you can do. So I would say spend more time on arranging the still life. I think that'll help. And this drawing, I just think there's like a washed out look to it. I think that you want to play with creating more vibrant, more luscious colors. I think right now it's just the value range is pretty low. I think the colors are not quite as strong as they could be. This piece feels pretty random. Like I don't really understand the relationship between the figure in the upper left to the figure in the front. I do like some of the textures in the hair. I think that's where I see you putting some more physical pressure. I'm not sure if this is supposed to be a sketch because you spent a lot of time on the hair and that's working really well. But I would just say when you're developing pieces, you don't want to let one part of the drawing get ahead of the other. Like you really want to develop all the different parts of the drawing at the same pace. And here it's like there are whole areas of the background that haven't even touched, and yet you've spent a lot of time like really developing the face. And so oftentimes that's what leads to a drawing feeling uneven and fragmented because things progress at a different rate. It's hard to get them to work together. So this piece, I would say, it just feels lopsided. So try to make sure as you're building the hair, you're also addressing the background, because if you have a color in the background, that's really going to affect how we look at the figure. Like if we had a bright red background, the figure would look very pale. Now, if we had a very gray background, the figure would look more vibrant. So you want to think about colors in terms of relationships, like a grouping of colors. Like how does the red of that figure in the upper right-hand corner, how does that affect the skin tone of that figure? And that goes back to what I said earlier about seeing relationships between the different pieces of your drawing. This piece I really like. I think that there's a nice sense of lighting, which I haven't seen in your other pieces. Like the figure on the left has a pretty visible cast shadow. The figure on the right has a cast shadow. It's a little bit muddled, a little bit hard to see. And so I like the boldness of that. The background, I think, is confusing. Mostly it's the staircase that I think is pretty awkward. I like the plant. I'm not sure if the blue in the background, if that's supposed to be a window with curtains, or I thought for a second maybe it was mountains in the background. I'm not totally sure. But again, it's like you have a very ambitious composition and that's great. But you also have a lot of parts of the painting that, again, are just empty. And so I would say in general, it's probably better for you just to make sure you cover everything, whether it's a painting, whether it's a drawing. It doesn't have to be like really thick, but I think that it's almost like if you're looking at a painting and there's like raw parts of the canvas showing, just that alone can give the drawing a feeling that it's not resolved. And so I would start with that. And then maybe as you get more experienced, you can play with intentionally showing those raw parts of the canvas. But I think what I've seen is that a lot of people have never had that experience. Like they've always made work that had blank parts of the page. And until you really know what that's like to like fill everything in, it's hard to really know like what's too far and what's not far enough. And I think it's better at this stage for you to overdo it, to add too much to the drawing and then pull back, rather than always like inching towards finish. Like you really want to learn how to like finish a piece. And it's funny because it seems like a really simple goal. But when I was teaching in college, I mean, there were a lot of students, it took them the whole semester before they could really understand what it meant to finish a piece. This is one of your best pieces in terms of space. Like, I feel like I really understand, okay, the relationship of the figures, where they are, the background pushes further into the distance. So I might use this drawing almost as a reference for how to create that space. Now, that said, though, there's other things you can do to make it more convincing. For example, I think if you could really spend some time thinking about lighting, I think that will help a lot, because lighting is a great way to, number one, make the figures feel more dimensional. And also, it's really helpful in terms of defining a space, because the lighting can really articulate pockets of space. So if you have part of the space that's like all in shadow, if you have a part that really is flooded with light, we can understand the organization of the space a lot better. And you're doing some of the lighting, like this very large figure in the center. I can clearly see the shadows on the leg, the shadows on the arm. But the thing is, you have the cast shadows underneath the feet. And that's actually the opposite, because that says to me that the lighting's coming from the right, but then the legs tell me the light is coming from the left. So your lighting situation, it's really inconsistent. And I think if you really start to break down, like, how does lighting actually function, I think it'll really help you a lot. I think with this feels more like a sketch to me, and I'm so glad you're doing 3D, because I don't think enough people do it. I think 3D is really fun, and it can really enhance your overall sensibility as an artist. I do think, though, that it does feel like a piece of a sculpture. Like, I definitely look at it and I want more. I feel like I would love to have 8 forms instead of just 3. I feel like there could be more interaction. Like, what if one of these was going through something else? The colors feel pretty random. I mean, you might try doing some 3D pieces where the material is all one color, because I think painting sculpture is actually really difficult. I think very few people do it well. And if you're new to sculpture, it's probably better for you to start by just using the inherent color of the material. So for example, if you're doing a cardboard sculpture, just leave it the brown cardboard color so you can really focus on the form. I think sometimes the colors, they get in the way of us really seeing the form. This one, I like what you're starting to do in the background, but the figures do feel like they're pasted onto the surface. And I think that they feel like they're floating a little bit. So I would definitely spend some time on the background around the figures, because it does feel like this black shape here, it just stops. And my assumption is that it would keep going, or something else would pop up here. So again, think about the background to the figure. It's really hard. I mean, there are very few people, I think, who have this skill and can really pull it off. It's very hard to make figures really sink into the background. So one thing you can try is sometimes the physical contact between the figure and the background. So for example, if somebody is sitting on a couch, you can maybe have wrinkles in the couch that show the person's weight. In this case, maybe their feet have a little bit of sand on them, so we see that physical contact. This piece, I like the ambition, but it's all over the place space-wise. And it's odd that the figure in the front is so bright yellow, because the other figures are pretty naturalistic in terms of colors, like they're believable. But then the yellow figure sticks out, and I don't see compelling reason for why. That's not to say that you can't do that. It's just you want to have some indication in the drawing why that is. Like maybe it's something in the narrative, maybe that figure is meant to be more of a symbol and less of a literal person. But yeah, I think this piece really needs thumbnail sketches. I think you got to figure out where things are. Like you have this animal in the lower left-hand corner. I think it might be a dog, but it's definitely floating. But then this figure has like very clear shadows. So I'll send you some videos, but mostly the thing about cast shadows, for them to be really distinct and crisp like these, that usually has to be like very bright, like middle of the day sunlight. And so the thing is, if that yellow figure has that, that would mean the dog should also have that. So the dog not having any shadows is confusing as far as the lighting goes. I love this piece. I think that you have really rich blacks and browns in the background. I think that the flowers don't quite fit the rest of the piece. They feel a little bit more impressionistic, whereas the pieces on the right, like the blue bottle, I think that that looks like it more fits in the real world. So you might think about keeping your style just a little bit more consistent within the same piece, and then really work on the drapery at the bottom, because that is the closest to us, but it feels unfinished and it doesn't really have the weight that the rest of the still life has. So keep that in mind. I know wrinkles are really, really hard to do, but it's not something you want to run away from because it can definitely seem like an area that just isn't addressed. This is great. I love this piece. I think you should look at Emil Nold's work. He's a German expressionist painter, and I love the lighting. I think the little touch of orange in the blue sky is beautifully done. The shapes of the cars, one being small, one being large, beautifully done. I like the complementary colors on the left, the little touches of yellow on the purple. This is a great piece. I really like this piece a lot. Okay, so the sculptures, I think it's a tech issue. I don't know what kind of clay you're using, but if you're not using ceramic clay, you probably need to use air dry clay or polymer clay. Probably what you could do is maybe making little maquettes. It's like basically a little 3D sketch. So what you do is instead of starting with like the sculpture, make like little mini sculptures and sketch out, okay, what are different ways I could do this? Because this piece, I think, is just suffering from technical issues right now. So if you sketch them out small scale, that can be helpful. Get aggressive with this. I think that there's some nice rendering of the musculature, but I think to really get something out of a master copy, you really got to finish it. So like if you look at George Bellows, like he's got very extensive backgrounds. And I think leaving this background so blank, it's like you're not getting as much out of the master copy experience as you could. Because master copies are not really about the finish. They're just about really getting to an artist's head and really analyzing their technique. So I guess the thing about a master copy, as long as you're feeling like you're learning something from it, that's fine. But I do think leaving parts out like the background does make it hard for you to see those relationships. This piece, I think it's just fragmented. I think the composition's a little bit boring. You have a lot of horizontals. We have a lot of videos on composition that I'll send to you. But in general, horizontal lines tend to be pretty static. Same thing with vertical ones. And so usually like any indication of a diagonal that you can take advantage of is very helpful. And then just be careful about the color schemes because the painting in the upper right, it's like bright saturated colors, but then the lower section is like very monochromatic. And so what ends up happening is the monochromatic area, it's like it can't compete with the bright colors. And so just think about whether you want to have that clash or maybe it should all be saturated colors. I don't know. I mean, it depends on what you're after, but just keep that in mind. This piece, I think you're struggling a little bit with the anatomy, specifically with foreshortening. And you got to be careful about black and white against color. It's like what I was saying in the earlier one, because what happens is the black and white of the figure, it just starts to feel really dull because of the yellow. Now, if you had a gray background, we'd look at it very differently. But look at the anatomy, especially like in the collarbones. I think it's a little bit awkward. Watch out for proportions. I don't know if you want it to be accurate proportions, but if you do, the shoulders are not broad enough. So that's where the anatomy can really help you. I would look at some Kathy Kollwitz drawings because what I'm seeing here is that you're relying a lot on smudging, and smudging can help, but I find that sometimes people blend too much. And what's nice about Kathy Kollwitz is she's very assertive about her marks, and she does not have a lot of blending or shading, and yet her portraits, they have a really volumetric feel to them. So take a look at her work. I really like this piece. I think don't be afraid of going dark because you have some dark areas, but I think you could go further. And I really like the pants on this larger figure. Like you did a great job on these wrinkles. These really look fantastic. But I think, again, like not having the ground here, the figures do feel like they're floating. So I'd love to see you work on this more because I don't think it's that the drawing is a problem. I just think it's not done yet. I just think it needs more work. And then this piece, I think it's just too blurry. I think you got to pick out a couple spots to give it more detail. Like I would assume that the bottom should have more detail because it's closer to us and the background should have less, but you have it reversed. Like the background is more detailed than the foreground. So that's again where you have to like break down spatially what it is you're trying to achieve. This piece, I like the painterly strokes and I like the purples in the figure in the middle, but the background, it feels pasted on, and the yellow at the bottom, it feels like you're just filling it in. So I think I would consider getting more texture or more of an indication of where things are spatially. This piece is pretty good, but I think you got to learn to use your eraser more, because it seems like you're struggling a little bit with the charcoal. So think about just putting more charcoal on the paper, and then when you erase with the eraser, it will have a richer look to it. Because this is a piece I think you could keep working on. I just think that it's like the amount of charcoal dust that's on the paper is insufficient. And so it's like you don't have enough pigment to work with. So think about that. This piece, I like what's happening with the figures, but the background just is getting in the way. And it's very empty on the left and on the right. So I think you got to think about, like, just push that stuff in the back, the blue shapes, fill in the left, and then maybe some stronger contrast in the figures to make them pop. This piece, I'm going to guess, is more like a sketch. I feel like it's pretty inconsistent in that you spent a lot of time on the face, and I think you did a nice job on the chin and the mouth. Like, I think the chin and the mouth are better than the eye. The eye feels pretty flat. It looks like you're relying a little bit too much on the details of a photo reference. But hair is very difficult to do, and I think oftentimes people don't spend a lot of time on it because they're so engaged with the face. I mean, that's very common with a portrait. But I would really think about getting that hair more volumetric and just spreading your attention more, because it's like you're putting all your eggs in one basket. Like, if I take away the eyes, nose, and the mouth, there's not a lot left to look at, and you don't want that to be the case. You want the drawing to really engage from every point of view. So Rohan, I hope this is helpful. I will send you the names of the artists in an email and also some video recommendations. But I think it's great that you're so invested in your work and that you have so much of it, and you clearly have a drive and an interest in keeping going with the work. And so hopefully I've given you some tips you can use to fill in some of those blanks. So good luck with that.